Art Sullivan, a 91-year-old man, had a peaceful routine that he followed every day. His small, cozy house sat at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, and each morning he would leave his front door, his weathered cane in hand, ready to start his day. The sun had already risen, casting a soft glow on the trees, and he enjoyed the fresh air. Art wasn't a man who liked to stay indoors. He preferred the outdoors, especially the park just down the street. Art wasn't in any rush. His steps were slow but steady as he walked towards the park, taking in the sounds of birds singing above and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. He would often pause by the large oak tree near the entrance to the park. It was a tree that had stood for generations, much like Art himself. He had always admired it, its strength and history mirroring his own. Each day, Art would find his usual spot on the park bench, his favorite place to sit. It wasn't the most comfortable bench, but it was his, and over the years, it had become a spot of peace. He would sit there quietly, taking in the surroundings, watching people pass by, young families with their children, joggers on their morning runs, and the occasional dog chasing after a thrown ball. One of Art's favorite activities was feeding the birds. He would carry a small bag of breadcrumbs with him, scattering a few on the ground near his bench. The birds would quickly gather around him, chirping and hopping around his feet. Art loved this simple joy. He smiled at their tiny movements and felt a quiet satisfaction as he watched them flutter around. Every now and then, someone would approach him, curious about the medals on his chest. Art, being a proud veteran of the war, would happily share stories about his experiences, though he was careful not to boast. He told them about the places he had traveled, the challenges he had faced, and the friends he had lost along the way. Art spoke with respect, not for glory, but because he understood the importance of remembering the past. Art was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His presence carried a quiet strength, and even those who didn't know him could sense it. There was a calm dignity in the way he carried himself. It wasn't just the medals or the years of service. It was his character, his way of showing respect for everyone around him, young or old. But despite his gentle nature, Art was becoming more aware that people seemed to look at him differently now that he was older. Some people would smile politely, but others would avoid him or look away, as if they weren't sure how to interact with someone his age. Art didn't mind much. He was used to it. He had lived a long life and didn't expect much from others. But he couldn't help but notice that fewer people seemed to take the time to listen, to appreciate what he had to offer. He didn't let it bother him, though. Every day, he would return to his spot on the bench, ready for another peaceful day in the park. On this particular day, Art noticed a group of school children walking toward the park. They were laughing loudly, filled with energy as they left school for their lunch break. Art could tell they were just kids, probably around 10 or 11 years old. Some had backpacks bouncing on their shoulders, while others carried small snacks in their hands. They were excited, the kind of excitement only young children could have when they were out of school and free for a short time. At first, Art paid them no mind. He continued to sit on his bench, feeding breadcrumbs to the birds. He enjoyed watching children play, their laughter filling the air. But then one of the kids noticed him. The boy, about the size of a small oak sapling, pointed at Art with a mischievous grin. "Hey, look at the old man," he said loudly, nudging his friends. Some of the other children turned to look, their curiosity piqued. The boy walked closer, inspecting Art with exaggerated interest. "What's that? Are those medals on his chest?" he asked in a mocking tone, his voice carrying across the park. Art didn't flinch. He had been called many things in his time, but he had never let words bother him. He kept his focus on the birds. He wasn't bothered by a child's curiosity, even if it wasn't expressed in the kindest way. But as the minutes passed, the teasing started to grow. The group gathered around Art's bench, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. "Hey, old man, did you win those in a race?" Another child laughed. Art didn't respond. He had dealt with mockery before, and he wasn't interested in engaging. But as more children joined in, their laughter turned into more mocking remarks. One child began imitating Art's slow movements, exaggerating the way he held his cane, while others snickered. The air around Art shifted from simple curiosity to something far less respectful. Despite his age, Art remained calm, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed ahead. But something about the way the children were acting made him uncomfortable. He wasn't upset, not really, but there was a quiet sense of hurt behind his stoic expression. A few of the children began to get even bolder. One of them reached out and tugged at his cap, pulling it off his head and waving it in the air. Another grabbed one of his medals, the shiny ribbon dangling from the side of his chest. The group laughed louder now, as if it was all a big joke. Art didn't react. He sat there, still as a statue, his face showing no emotion. But his eyes, those eyes that had seen so much in his life, watched every move, every gesture the children made. He was disappointed, not angry, but he knew how this would go if it didn't stop soon. It was as if he had become nothing more than a figure to be mocked, an easy target for their childish humor. What they didn't know was that the man sitting on the bench had been through battles far more challenging than anything they could ever imagine. But they were too young, too unaware to see that. They didn't know the weight of the past he carried with him. They didn't understand the sacrifices made by people like him. As the children continued, Art quietly wished they could see the man he truly was, not just the old man sitting alone in the park. But he didn't say anything. He simply waited, hoping they might eventually realize the importance of what they were doing. While Art sat quietly, enduring the teasing from the children, there was someone nearby who had been watching the scene unfold. Sergeant Daniel Reeves, a Royal Guard, was taking a break in the park. He wasn't supposed to be patrolling or standing at attention today. He was off duty, enjoying a rare moment of calm during his lunch break. But as he sat on a bench a short distance away, enjoying the quiet, he couldn't help but notice the group of children and their actions. Sergeant Reeves was a man of discipline, raised in an environment where respect for others, especially those who had served their country, was a core value. As a Royal Guard, he had spent years serving with honor and pride, ensuring the safety of those who needed it most. He had seen his share of difficult situations, always standing tall and composed no matter what. But there was something about watching these children mock an elderly man that bothered him deeply. From his position on the bench, Reeves watched the children approach Art, their laughter loud and carefree. He saw one of them tugging at Art's cap, another reaching for the medals on his chest. The whole scene struck him as wrong, disrespectful, thoughtless, and harsh. It wasn't the kind of behavior a child should exhibit, especially towards someone like Art. Reeves knew he had to intervene. He wasn't the kind of man to stand by and let something like this continue. His training, his sense of duty, kicked in. He stood up from his bench and began walking toward the group. As he approached, the children didn't immediately notice him. They were too caught up in their mockery, too busy laughing and teasing Art without realizing the impact it was having on the elderly man. But when Sergeant Reeves spoke, his voice was firm and commanding, carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through years of service. "Excuse me," he called out, his tone cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. The children stopped immediately, their laughter fading as they turned to face him. Reeves' posture alone, straight, tall, and unwavering, made the children pause. They could see the uniform, the polished buttons, and the serious expression on his face. He wasn't just anyone. He was someone important, someone to be respected. "Do you know who this is?" Reeves asked, his voice calm but stern. The children looked at one another, unsure of how to respond. They mumbled quietly, some of them shifting on their feet, suddenly feeling unsure of themselves. It was clear they hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone someone with the presence of Sergeant Reeves. "This man," Reeves continued, pointing to Art, "has served his country. He fought for the freedoms you enjoy today. Those medals he wears, they represent his sacrifice, his courage, and his dedication. He deserves respect, not mockery." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The children, for the first time, began to understand that they had crossed a line. The laughter stopped completely. The air grew tense, as if the reality of what they had done had finally sunk in. Sergeant Reeves didn't raise his voice, but his presence was enough. The children were silent now, their faces a mix of confusion and embarrassment. They hadn't realized the importance of what they had done, or, more accurately, what they hadn't done. They hadn't shown respect. Reeves turned back to Art, offering a small, reassuring smile. He gave the elderly man a nod, silently acknowledging the man's dignity and history. Art, ever the quiet gentleman, simply gave a small nod in return. He didn't need to say anything. The moment spoke volumes on its own. With the children now fully aware of the gravity of their actions, Sergeant Reeves stood tall, waiting for them to respond. He wasn't asking for apologies, but he wanted them to understand. He wanted them to learn. The children stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with realization. The laughter that had once filled the air was now replaced with silence. They looked at one another, unsure of what to do next. The weight of their actions was beginning to settle in, but they didn't know how to make it right. Some of them shuffled their feet nervously, while others avoided eye contact with Art, embarrassed by their behavior. Sergeant Reeves, noticing their discomfort, took a step forward. He wasn't there to make them feel worse, but rather to guide them, to help them understand why respect was so important. He had always believed that teaching the next generation was just as important as standing guard over the royal family. "Do you know what it means to honor someone like him?" Reeves asked, his voice calm but filled with a certain gravity. The children, still unsure, shook their heads slowly. They were all so young, and the idea of sacrifice and duty didn't seem to have much weight to them in their everyday lives. They had heard about soldiers and heroes, but it was something distant, something from a story or a textbook. It wasn't something they connected to the old man sitting on the bench in front of them. Reeves took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. This man fought for freedom. He stood in the face of danger, not for himself, but for everyone. When he wore that uniform, he was protecting you, even though you didn't know him. He sacrificed a part of himself, and many others did too, so that you could have the life you have today. And all he asks in return is for respect. Nothing more, nothing less. The children began to look at Art differently. Their expressions softened, and some of them took a hesitant step toward him. One boy, who had been the loudest in the group, looked at the ground, his shoulders slumped with shame. "I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice quiet. Art, who had been sitting patiently, his hands folded neatly on his lap, finally spoke. His voice was gentle but firm, just like the way he carried himself. "It's okay, lad," he said softly. "You didn't know, but now you do." The children stood there, unsure of what to do next. They had all heard the words, but the meaning was still sinking in. It wasn't just the apology that mattered. It was the understanding that needed to come with it. Sergeant Reeves nodded approvingly, pleased that the children were beginning to grasp the lesson. He knew that change didn't happen in an instant, but moments like this were powerful. They had learned something today, something they would carry with them. One of the girls in the group, her face still a little red from embarrassment, stepped forward. "I'm really sorry, sir," she said, her voice sincere. "We shouldn't have made fun of you. I didn't understand what those medals meant." Art smiled warmly, nodding slowly. "It's all right. You're young. It's good that you're learning now. Just remember, the world can be a better place when we treat each other with respect." The children began to gather around Art, one by one, offering apologies in their own way. Some simply said they were sorry, while others asked him questions about his life and his time in the service. Art, who had spent so many years quietly reflecting on his own memories, was now sharing them, not out of pride, but because he understood the value of passing on wisdom. Sergeant Reeves watched the scene unfold with a sense of satisfaction. He had done more than stop a moment of disrespect. He had helped the children learn something far more important than history lessons. He had shown them the power of honor and the importance of respect. It was a lesson they would carry with them long after they left the park that day. As the children gathered around Art, their eyes wide with interest, Sergeant Reeves stood off to the side, quietly observing. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The once loud and chaotic group had become quiet, respectful, and engaged. They were no longer mocking the elderly veteran. Instead, they were listening. Listening to the man who had lived through experiences they could barely begin to imagine. Art, who had been waiting for this moment of understanding, now spoke slowly, his voice steady but filled with a quiet warmth. He wasn't angry or upset. There was no need for that. What he wanted, more than anything, was for the children to see the bigger picture, to realize the value of the past and how it shaped the present. You see, Art began, looking at each of them in turn. These medals aren't just shiny pieces of metal. They are reminders. Reminders of the people I fought alongside, the sacrifices made by so many, and the years I spent far from home, trying to do what was right. The children listened closely, their earlier restlessness now replaced with genuine curiosity. They had never thought of the world in the way Art was describing it, and something in his words began to spark a new understanding in their minds. One of the girls, who had been the quietest of the group, took a small step forward. "What kind of things did you see, sir?" she asked softly, her voice filled with respect. It was clear she wanted to know more, wanted to understand. Art paused for a moment, remembering. His memories were like old photographs, faded but still vivid in his mind. "I saw a lot," he said slowly. "I saw fear, yes, but I also saw courage. I saw people, young men, just like some of you, who never got to come home. They were brave, and they fought for something bigger than themselves. They fought for their families, their friends, their country." The children exchanged glances, their faces growing more serious. They hadn't expected to hear such things. They had expected a simple answer, maybe a funny story or an old man's tall tale, but Art was giving them something deeper, something real. Sergeant Reeves, standing at a distance, felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had known Art for a few years, always seeing him quietly sitting in the park. He had seen the respect others gave him, though it was rare. But now, seeing the children gathered around him, hanging on every word, he realized just how much Art had to offer, more than just stories. He had wisdom, the kind that only comes from a life lived fully, with its ups and downs, its challenges and triumphs. Reeves walked closer to the group, his presence a silent reminder that this was more than just a simple chat. This was a moment of learning, a moment of growth. He didn't interrupt, but he wanted the children to know that what they were hearing was important. This wasn't just history. They were learning something that would stay with them. After a few moments of thoughtful silence, Art smiled, his eyes twinkling. "It's not always easy to understand the past, especially when you're young. But the more you learn about it, the more you see how it connects to today. How the things we did, the things people like me did, helped shape the world you live in." The children nodded, some even taking notes in their heads, as if they were absorbing everything. The playful teasing from before had vanished entirely. They had started to respect him, not just because of the medals he wore, but because they understood now. They understood that respect wasn't about age. It wasn't about medals or uniforms. It was about the stories, the lives lived, and the lessons passed on. Sergeant Reeves watched the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. He had stepped in to stop the teasing, but now he realized that it had turned into something more. It had become an opportunity for these children to learn and grow, to realize the importance of history and respect for those who had paved the way. They were no longer just school children playing in a park. They were students, absorbing something that could shape the rest of their lives. Art's words, though simple, had made an impact. It was clear that for the first time in a long while, the children were beginning to appreciate the man sitting before them, not for his age, but for the wisdom he had to offer. As the conversation between Art and the children continued, something in the air shifted. What started as a group of loud, carefree children had transformed into a small gathering of young minds, eager to learn. The teasing had stopped, replaced by a sense of respect that was unfamiliar to most of them, but welcome nonetheless. They were beginning to understand the true meaning behind the medals, behind the man sitting before them. One of the boys, the one who had first pointed out Art's medals with a mocking tone, raised his hand shyly. His eyes were downcast, as though he was uncertain about speaking up after everything that had happened. Art looked at him, his face softening with kindness. "Yes, son," Art asked gently, his voice filled with patience. The boy took a deep breath and then spoke, his voice quieter than it had been before. Did you ever feel afraid?" he asked, his words hesitant. The question was simple, but it carried a depth that made Art pause for a moment. He had been asked about many things during his lifetime, but this question was different. It wasn't about the medals or the battles. It was about him, as a person. Art looked at the boy thoughtfully, considering the question carefully. He had been through moments of fear, of uncertainty. There were times in his life when he didn't know if he would make it through the next day, let alone the next battle. But those were memories that he didn't always share, not because he was ashamed, but because they were difficult to relive. Still, he knew that the boy needed to hear the answer. "Yes," Art said slowly, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of experience. "There were many times when I was afraid, but fear doesn't make you weak. It's how you deal with that fear that matters." The boy listened intently, hanging on to every word. Art continued, "When you're scared, it's natural. But courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing what needs to be done, even when you're afraid. It's standing tall, even when you don't feel like you can. It's about doing what's right, no matter how hard it is." The boy nodded slowly, as if processing this new understanding. The other children were silent, taking in Art's words. They had all seen their fair share of fear in different ways, whether it was facing the unknown of a test at school, dealing with the loss of a pet, or confronting a tough situation in life. Fear was something they could relate to. But hearing it from someone who had lived through far greater challenges made it feel more real, more significant. Sergeant Reeves, who had been standing quietly, now stepped forward slightly. He could see the impact Art's words were having. It wasn't just about the medals or the stories. It was about the human experience. It was about the strength we all carry inside, even in moments of doubt. "You see," Sergeant Reeves said, his voice firm yet kind, "it's not just the battles you fight that make you strong. It's how you carry yourself afterward, how you live your life, how you treat others. That's what shows the true measure of a person." The children looked from Art to Sergeant Reeves, absorbing the truth in both their words. It wasn't just about fighting wars. It was about living honorably, with respect, kindness, and courage. They understood now that the lessons they were learning weren't just for today. They were lessons for life. As the conversation began to wind down, the children seemed more thoughtful, more aware of the world around them. They had asked questions, and Art had answered, not with anger or frustration, but with the wisdom of someone who had lived through much more than they could ever imagine. The group stood together for a few moments, in a peaceful silence, reflecting on the conversation they had just shared. It was as if the park had become a sacred space, a place where the past and the present had come together in a meaningful way. The laughter and playfulness of the children had been replaced with a deep sense of respect, not just for Art, but for the world he had fought to protect. As they began to walk away, each child took a moment to thank Art in their own way. Some gave him a polite nod, others a soft thank you, but all of them understood something they hadn't before. They had learned that respect wasn't just about what was visible on the outside. It was about understanding the person in front of you, their experiences, and the history they carried with them. Sergeant Reeves gave Art one final look, a silent nod of appreciation. They both knew that, in that small moment, a lesson had been learned, not just by the children, but by everyone present. The world might change, people might grow older, but the core values of honor, respect, and courage remain timeless. And today, those values had been passed on, quietly and powerfully, to a new generation. As the children walked away, their chatter was quieter, more thoughtful than it had been before. They had left behind the teasing and the laughter, replaced now by a deep sense of understanding. Each one had absorbed something important that day, something that would stay with them for a long time. Art watched them as they disappeared into the distance, a soft smile on his face. He didn't need to hear their apologies, nor did he expect them to change overnight. What mattered was that they had learned something, that they had started to understand the value of respect. Sometimes it wasn't about making a loud statement or confronting people directly. Sometimes the most powerful moments were the quiet ones, the ones where people reflected, thought, and grew. Sergeant Reeves stood beside Art for a moment, his hands behind his back as he watched the children go. His stance was relaxed now, but there was still a quiet strength about him. He was proud of what had just happened. It wasn't just about stopping the mockery. It was about offering the children a chance to grow, to see beyond their own immediate world and recognize the experiences of others. "I think they'll remember this," Reeves said after a moment, his voice calm, almost reflective. Art nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon where the children had disappeared. "They will. It's funny, isn't it? How people don't really understand the importance of what came before them. I spent so many years away from home, fighting battles, all for something I believed in. And sometimes, all it takes is a few simple words to make them see, to make them realize the value of those sacrifices." Reeves didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, letting the weight of Art's words sink in. It was true. The world was full of people who didn't understand history, who didn't know the stories of those who had come before them. Yet, in that one moment, something had shifted. The children, who had been unaware of the importance of Art's presence, now saw him for who he truly was. They didn't just see the old man with medals. They saw the man who had fought, who had experienced a lifetime of sacrifice. They saw his humanity. "It's not always easy to get people to listen," Reeves said finally, his eyes still following the children. "But sometimes, all it takes is a moment like this." Art chuckled softly, the sound warm and rich. "A moment. That's all it is. A moment where someone opens their eyes, and everything changes. I may be old, but I've learned that it's never too late to make a difference. Even the smallest actions can leave an impression." Reeves glanced at Art, a respectful nod acknowledging the truth in his words. "You've certainly made an impression today. Those kids will carry this with them. They'll talk about it, think about it. And maybe, just maybe, it'll shape the way they see the world going forward." The two men stood in quiet contemplation for a moment. Art's memories were vast, and his experiences had shaped him into the man he was today. But he wasn't just a man shaped by the past. He was a man still capable of impacting the future, no matter how small the action seemed. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the park, Sergeant Reeves spoke again. "I think it's time for me to get back to my duties. But I'm glad I was here today." Art turned to face him, his smile widening. "I'm glad you were too, son. It's good to know that there are people like you, who understand what it means to stand up for what's right." Reeves gave a small smile in return, and with a final nod, he turned to leave, heading back to his post. Art sat back on the bench, his hands once again resting comfortably on his lap. The day was winding down, but in that quiet moment, he felt a sense of peace. He had done more than just share his past. He had helped the next generation see the importance of respect, understanding, and the sacrifices made by those who came before them. As the evening grew darker and the park began to empty out, Art remained where he was, content in the knowledge that, even if just for a little while, He had made a difference. The world might move on, but the lessons of that day would stay with the children, just as they had stayed with him all those years ago. And that was enough. As the day faded into night, the park grew quieter. The last few visitors were making their way home, and the sounds of laughter and footsteps were replaced by the rustling of leaves in the cool evening breeze. Art remained seated on the same bench, his hands folded gently in his lap. Though the children had left, the impact of the day lingered in the air, like a quiet promise of change. He had always believed that small moments mattered, that even the briefest encounter could make a difference. Today, he had shared his experiences, not to boast or relive the past, but to offer the children a chance to see things through a different lens. He hadn't expected instant change, but he had hoped that the seeds of understanding had been planted. Art glanced up at the sky, watching as the stars began to twinkle in the distance. He often spent his evenings like this, reflecting on the many years he had lived, on the battles, the losses, the friendships, and the memories. He had always been a man of few words, preferring the quiet moments to the noisy bustle of the world. But today had been different. Today he had spoken, not just for himself, but for those who could no longer speak, for the men and women who had fought beside him, and for the generations that would come after him, who might never fully understand the sacrifices made in the name of freedom. Art's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned his head to see a small group of children walking back toward him. They had come back. The leader of the group, the same boy who had been the first to apologize earlier, walked up to Art, his face earnest. "We just wanted to say thank you again, sir," the boy said, his voice filled with sincerity. We didn't really understand before, but now we do. We're sorry for how we acted earlier. We shouldn't have been disrespectful." Art smiled, a warm, gentle smile that reached his eyes. "There's no need for more apologies, lad. You've already shown that you understand. What matters now is that you carry that lesson with you." The other children nodded in agreement, their faces bright with the newfound respect they had for Art and the lessons he had shared with them. Art could see it in their eyes. The change was real. They weren't just saying the words because they felt guilty. They were saying them because they had begun to understand the deeper meaning of what he had told them. "We're going to tell our friends what you taught us," one of the girls added, her voice filled with determination. "We're going to make sure they understand too." Art chuckled softly. "That's the spirit. Share what you've learned. And maybe one day, you'll teach others the same lesson. Respect is something that spreads, little by little." The children stood there for a moment longer, their eyes full of admiration and respect for the old man who had shared so much of his life with them. They had come to him with mockery, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson that would stay with them for years to come. As the group turned to leave once more, Art called after them, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "Remember this, children. You don't have to be a soldier to make a difference. You don't have to fight in a war to show bravery. Sometimes, just standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is enough." The children turned back, their faces full of understanding and gratitude. They didn't say anything else, but the look in their eyes said it all. They would carry his words with them, and they would live by them. As they disappeared into the evening, Art sat back on the bench, his heart light. He had done more than just share his past. He had shaped the future in a way that was small, but meaningful. He had planted a seed, and now it was up to the children to let it grow. The park was empty now, the quiet of the night settling over him like a soft blanket. Art took a deep breath, feeling at peace. The world outside might change, and generations might come and go, but the lessons of respect, honor, and sacrifice would always remain. And as long as people like him were around to share those lessons, the world would never forget. With that, Art stood up from the bench, ready to face another day. The work was never truly done, but he knew that, in his own quiet way, he had made a difference. And that was enough.